Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Jessie Frazier in the History and Gender and Women's Studies departments, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us here today in celebration of Women's History Month. This talk is sponsored by the Department of History, the Gender and Women's Studies Department, the Harrington School of Communication and Media, the Multicultural Center, and the College of Arts and Sciences. So a special thank you to all of them as well. Next week, there will be a film screening of The Woman King on Wednesday at 7 o'clock in Edwards Auditorium in celebration of International Women's Day, so please join us for that as well. And now I'd like to invite Professor Katie McIntyre of the Honors Program in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies to come up and introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Welcome, buenas tardes a todos. A special shout out to GWS students from Professor Pisa's Introduction to Latin American and Caribbean Studies and my Gender and Sexuality in Latin America class, as well as International Women's Issues class. Thank you. It's wonderful to have our guest here today in celebration of Women's History Month and the upcoming International Women's Day, which is next week, as Professor Frazier mentioned. I'm really pleased to have you here, and I want to start with just some basic words of introduction. Dr. Sandra Saēnchez López is a professor of journalism at La Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. She has a PhD in history from the State University of New York at Binghamton. She has been awarded many fellowships, grants, and awards. I'll just mention one that we share in common, and I was very excited to see. In 2013, while she was a graduate student, she was the recipient of the American Association of University Women dissertation completion grant, which I also had, and it's a wonderful way to support women in academia here in the U.S. Today, in her talk, Contesting the Rules of Journalism, Paradoxes of the Women's Press in Mid-20th Century Colombia, Professor Saēnchez López is going to look at the ways that women journalists resisted, but also sometimes reproduced, hierarchies of power in the publishing world in mid-20th century Colombia. We will hear about lots of resistance, perseverance, and new struggles today in her talk. Her scholarship is particularly innovative in that she uses digital media as a way to create and circulate history more broadly to reach a broader audience. She has many publications. I'll just mention one. Soon, her newest book will be published by Rowman and Littlefield, and it's called Battles for Belonging, Women Journalists, Political Culture, and Exclusion in Colombia, 1943 to 1968. I will say that we're very fortunate to have Professor Saēnchez López here today. She has a fellowship at Brown University. She's a short-term visiting scholar in their Department of Hispanic Studies. So we are so happy and so pleased to have you here at the start of Women's History Month. And I would like us all to give a fuerte aplauso for our speaker today, journalist Sandra Saēnchez López. Thank you.
Having me here. Thank you to you all for attending this talk, and also thank you to the departments who are involved and participating in this venture of having me here. So, of course, because this is my second language, I'm just gonna read, right? I'm cheating in this presentation. I'm just gonna work with the paper so I can fully address what I wanna say. So let's try. Quote, We all march in pursuit of beauty, and why not say it? Also in search of a handsome boy who governs, protects, directs, and sustains us. Unique and supreme ideals to which every truly feminine woman aspires and should aspire to. This is how Cucufata sarcastically began her first column in October 1944, as she made her way into the pages of Agitación Femenina, the first and most well-known of journalist Ofelia Uribe's print projects. Almost a decade after having run Agitación Femenina, she founded Verdad. A comic character author, Cucufata shared the pages of the periodical with regular writers and contributors of the periodical while humorously embodying daring opinions about existing gender arrangements. She deliberately mocked long-established expectations for women and sharply ridiculed femininity as an attribute to be drawn from beauty, marriage, and domesticity, while exposing the ignorance and stupidity of such a discourse. Accordingly, this discourse not only deserved to be problematized, but treated as plain ludicrous rhetoric. By giving life to this character author, Uribe accomplished two main goals of Agitación Femenina. On the one hand, she further condemned monolithic beliefs about women's lack of capacities to interact beyond marriage, and on the other, she audaciously stepped into the arena of satire, long dominated by men in the press. Cucufata was but one of the many strategies women journalists implemented as they entered the political and print cultures of mid-20th century. This is salient as we consider the 3-decade span of flourishing female author periodicals and women's actions to enlarge the public sphere between the 1940s and the 1960s. Indeed, almost a decade after Cucufata's appearance in the mid-1940s, women journalists continued to use various strategies to deepen their battles against women's alienation from politics and the press in Colombia. This time, however, they did so not by embracing humor and confronting gender expectations imposed on women, but by solemnly questioning the party-based discourse of male writers and consequently proposing a socially responsible journalism better conducted by women. A leading journalist in such a 1950s crusade was Maria Aurora Escobar, director of Mundo Femenino. She tirelessly condemned the sectarianism that permeated the mainstream press, for in her view, this increased partisan violence and turned journalism into a vile practice at the service of very few individuals and their personal interests. In Escobar's opinion, this could not be more detrimental to the large majority of Colombians. In the 1960s, Flor Romero, founder and director of Mujer, persevered with Uribe's and Escobar's objectives of destabilizing the press world as it existed. Like her predecessors, she too challenged the dominant press while participating in the making of the political imagination of social transformation. As in many other Latin American countries, in the early 1960s in Colombia came along with a growing sense of optimism about present change for a better future as the administrations welcomed additional international aid programs into the territory, primarily provided by the US and under the name of the Alliance for Progress. It is against this background that Romero experimented with photojournalism as a potent print genre. By inviting the work of renowned image makers, she launched an aggressive editorial line designed to complement the narrative of social change in a decade in which the country moved towards promises of peace, justice, and progress. Alongside written pieces, Romero resumed the work of graphic journalism in ways rarely seen in Colombia and never seen before in a female author print project in the country. She had high-end objectives in mind. Romero made usually marginalized subjects visually salient in Mujeres pieces, while aiming at giving them the space and the relevance the hegemonic press and magazines, dominated by men, hardly did. Although these women journalists' strategies varied over time, all three contested journalism and the press world as they were. While Uribe decisively turned to storytelling resources like satire to boldly confront the state of affairs in the 1940s, Escobar defined a civic-minded writing and press intended to represent all citizens' interests in the 1950s. She opposed the pervading language of violence in the country that underscored conflicts between liberals and conservatives, finding the mainstream press guilty of this. Romero, for her part, put forward an intrepid journalistic project, sealing an agreement between her and several selling names in image making, whom male press editors largely disregarded in the 1960s. She insisted on approving photojournalism to assert the need for an inclusive press, rhetoric of Colombian reality, while further stressing the competence of women in the existing press culture. But just as the strategies these women executed stood out as a strong contestation to a biased and exclusionary press culture, they fell into conspicuous contradictions. In a nutshell, as they defended their right to intervene in the public sphere and challenge journalism, women change but also reproduce existing hierarchies and stories of power and worth. These contradictions, however, did not imply that journalists left everything unchanged. Rather, what the contradictions reveal is that such a challenge and such a contestation also included a degree of consent, and more importantly, that power rearrangements were ongoing but difficult and always dynamic processes. This last point is the key of the larger argument of my coming book entitled Battles for Belonging. So today, for this talk, I have bad news for you. I will leave Escobar, Romero, the 1950s and the 1960s aside, and I will concentrate on Uribe's Agitación Femenina in the 1940s. So you see, I'm mean. I was like, yes, photojournalism, this is great, and now, okay, we're gonna keep it short, and we're gonna stay with the 1940s. Well, it is true that Uribe's Cucufata was transgressive. Not only did she ridicule social beliefs revolving around gender roles, but she also embodied humor as crafted and authored by women themselves. Just as transgressive as Cucufata was, the ambiguous nature of satire itself implied that she also restated portrayals of women's seemingly disparaging place in the social order. In her comic storytelling, beautiful women, reputedly apt for marriage, were usually shallow and witlessly continued to follow the established gender rules, while ugly and wrinkled women were those educated, intelligent, and outspoken, without a chance for love and marriage. Prejudice was inevitably part of the satire's game. The satirical commentary of Cucufata appeared in the periodical as early as its first issue and as striking in tone as any of the politically charged articles and reports the publication also featured. Among the advice checklist Cucufata presented on that opportunity, she included the following, quote, to sterilize the brain to prevent those harmful microorganisms called thoughts, reasoning, understanding, and will from overpowering. She reminded her readers that the woman's head is exclusively to fashion a hairstyle and wearing a hat. Cucufata continued with her burlesque note and recommended to never express an opinion to avoid unpleasantness, and never read, with the exception of the newspaper's social page, because reading weakens the eyelight, dulls the brightness of the gaze, and causes eyelashes to drop. Parodying advice columns, traditionally considered in the press world to be for women and about women's theme, comic character author Cucufata emerged in Agitación Femenina's pages to stir things around gender while laughing about prevalent notions of femininity that modeled other kinds of womanhood in the making. As far as reading, thinking, and speaking one's mind remain actions reportedly pertaining to, quote, disagreeable feminists, Cucufata had enough material to make fun of attributes such as love, tenderness, and beauty as qualities that described women as they should be and were expected to be, opposing alleged non-feminine feminists. With humor ingrained in sarcasm, she disapproved fixed ideas about women. Although the available sources do not indicate who Cucufata really was, the fact that she was a contributor in Agitación Femenina since the inauguration of the publication allows room to conjecture that Cucufata remained Uribe's nom de plume. Indeed, Uribe could have entertained Cucufata as a collaborative enterprise, perhaps brainstorming the features of the character with Lucila Rubio, one of her main partners in the political cause, or Rosa Maria Moreno Aguilera, another of her key interlocutors in the discussion about women's action. But Uribe's directly signed text in Agitación Femenina can also be an indication that she performed Cucufata herself while appropriating satire as a political storytelling strategy in the publication she directed. Uribe's pieces were piercing, eloquent, and abundant in frank and even merciless words whenever she denounced practices and prejudices against women's participation and autonomy as political and social agents. Writing about women's lack of political rights to cast the ballot in Colombia, for example, she stated, quote, that clumsy intention and crooked will have those who aspire to perpetuate the power of their hegemony, anesthetizing female intelligence with false gallantry. They are outdated and selfish mentalities that project their ideals toward a past already buried in the history of all civilized people. End quote. Read together, Cucufata and Uribe's writing appear to be close enough in fearlessness, cleverness, and fluidity, providing a margin to estimate that they were one and the same author. And even if Cucufata were not Uribe herself, what stands true is that the latter, the founder, director, and main editor of the periodical, had the power to authorize the former to appear in the pages of the publication as if she did exist, alongside other key sections. In many respects, Cucufata's column worked as typical political satire. They identify a target for social and political criticism, which is then treated comically. In Cucufata's case, the target was the complex bundle of social and behavioral expectations women had to abide by so that they remained confined to the private realm. Cucufata played the role of a woman who not only complied fully to social standards, but claimed to have the kind of expertise that helped women comply to those standards and thrive in them. As the main character author of the columns, she provided advice and tactics of all sorts for women to be as feminine as they could, so they eventually marry. This, of course, intended to be ironic. Such advice and tactics provided by Cucufata unmasked what they really were in the eyes of journalists like Uribe: absurd and demeaning demands that held women back from engaging in public life. Quote, talk to your boyfriend about the house cat and cry over the death of the canary bird. Tell him that your mother doesn't send you to school because there's a lot of trouble there, and instead you are taking cooking, piano, and sewing lessons to be a housewife, she advised to her readers. But Cucufata's satire was even more complex than it appeared at first glance. The name signature implied an additional comical aspect. As a nom de plume, Cucufata played with a common use of that very same word. The name was typically employed as a generic, derisive way to refer to women who exhibited behaviors or opinions that seemed to be out of line. The expression, "You're beginning to act like a Cucufata, Sandra," or "There she comes now, acting like the Cucufata she is," remain an everyday means of teasing women deemed as such among educated social sectors, mostly in the center of the country where Agitación Femenina was born. Because Cucufata authors signed the columns, they already suggested that the text would be somehow out of place and impertinent. This comprised yet another layer of Cucufata's satire. She surely could have been Mrs. Proper or Mrs. Tradition, for example, and the irony and sarcasm of the columns would still stand. Instead, she was Madame Cucufata, a pro-establishment woman, raw in her exposé, who underneath seemed to communicate presumably mad beliefs in women's favor. A written caricature, the peculiarity of her name signature indicated that the columns were also there to criticize those who would call a woman defending women's crusades crazy, even if she played the role of a pro-establishment woman like Cucufata. This reinforced Cucufata's irreverent nature as a character author and showed that, like any satire intended to really upset, Cucufata drew on circulating understandings and beliefs to reach her audience. Editorially, Cucufata remained in tune with Agitación Femenina's political purpose, and for that matter, with Uribe's goals, to disturb gender codes of journalism itself. As historian Christine Eric underscores, while delving into comic writer and sonic performer Nini Marshall's role in Argentina broadcasting, embracing humor in the media during the 20th century remained a groundbreaking action for any woman worldwide. It implied the use of improper language, including cruel, trivial, and colloquial words, as well as insolent and even insensitive attitudes, all of women's limits at the time. A defiant enterprise turned into satire disarticulated the largely accepted mandates for women journalists and thus contradicted both the general established norm of female propriety and the specific gender space of the press. Embodied by Cucufata, women's infiltration into print satire became a political weapon to continue shaking gender conventions in two major fronts. First, it allowed women journalists to attack the idea of a loving, dedicated, and beautiful woman suitable for marriage, and consequently, it allowed them to defend women's value based on qualities also determined by intellectual practices and activities outside the domestic realm. Cucufata portrayed the housewife with derision as a call against reproducing a reductive vision of women's roles in society. She did so too as a quest for women's development in public, visible, and diverse spaces different from the home. Quote, would there be something more charmingly feminine than the perpetual hustle and bustle of the housewife, from the bedroom to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the bedroom? She commented while again mocking gender expectations for women that drew from overvaluing their domestic involvement and downplaying their public performance. Second, Cucufata's appropriation of satire showed that women were no longer outsiders in the field of humor and that they, like men, could turn into a narrative of their own, the satire, right, and for their own female-oriented purposes. Briefly, just as men were able to express dissatisfaction with political affairs through print jokes, so too were women able to advance an agenda of inclusion and political participation by lampooning long-standing gender norms and those who perpetuated them. Cucufata came to light at a time when the so-called liberal republic had provided women with some rights, and several laws and decrees were issued in that regard. But although it is true that all of these laws and decrees improve the conditions of women's life on paper, the rights they granted remain generally unresolved in practice. In the eyes of journalists like Uribe, these recently sanctioned rights were but just a few, as women continued to be prevented from engaging in public activities, and their involvement was expected to be circumscribed primarily to the domestic sphere. Other sectors, like urban workers, had gained more attention and benefits than women from the ongoing 16-year liberal administration in place. Particularly, changes in urban laborers' lives became noticeable, and yet these remain a time of constant negotiation between government officials, the elites, and subalterns who intended to take advantage of the liberal republic's discourses about equality and inclusion to further their well-being. A clash between divergent visions of citizenship, autonomy, and participation persisted. This constituted the breeding ground for denunciation from those who felt still marginalized or those who identified unmet promises which kept them disenfranchised from designing their own destinies in their own emancipatory terms. In this climate, political elites continued to fuel their long-lived partisan conflicts, well known in Colombian history, and other Latin American countries as well. We have the bad reputation, but it is shared among, in the region. Fostering tensions among them. In the press, conservatives agitated the spurious against liberals in power, and liberals responded belligerently. Verbal assaults and fervent accusations overflowed the press. Cartoonists and satiric writers joined the debates and helped to keep the intense discussion alive during the liberal republic, attacking both sides of the equation with their political humor. They contributed to the ardent negotiations taking place by printing their work in the country's most renowned newspapers, such as El Tiempo, El Espectador, El Siglo, La Razón. Mockery remained their ammunition to shake politics while pointing out inconsistencies and dangers. José Gómez, known as Pepe Gómez, was one of the silent cartoonists while liberals were in power. Another key cartoonist was Adolfo Samper. Like Pepe Gómez and Samper, Cucufata had enough material to create a satiric narrative amidst the ongoing clashes of the 1940s, but this time from women's viewpoint. Importantly, her columns evince women journalists' awareness of the performative dimension of satire and its power. In the context of the press, writing itself entailed a performance of some sort, interpreting the role of a journalist who eloquently shared her judgment on national events and debates, demanding a knowledge of the type of script, rhythm, and language pertaining to the kind of setting the press was immersed in. This knowledge was but one step into the interpretation of the journalist's character. Practice after practice of such script, rhythm, and language ensured that the writer was ready to be put on stage for the audience. Cucufata's print satire took this performative dimension further. As a comic character author, she frequently relied on parody to put her irony and sarcasm forward, often playing two roles concurrently. The expert, pro-establishment woman mentioned above, concomitant with impersonations of readers who consulted with her about how to be truly feminine. She recreated then the entire scene. The parody of the correspondence between Cucufata and her readers mimicked the style of the traditional advice comic as a genre typically tailored and believed by leaders of the press world to be women's and about with female concern. In this fashion, Cucufata's text had a conversational-like tone based on short vignettes about the steps readers should follow to fulfill their desires. Exaggerating the nature of the genre, the column staged a clueless female reader who almost desperately asked Cucufata to rescue her from, quote, the horrors of being single by giving her a lesson on beauty, bodily disposition, and behavior, so she found a husband. What I like from you is for you to tell me how I should style my hair, what conversations I should consider interesting, how to pose so as to, in your judgment and extensive knowledge and understanding, have the most devastating impact on the male sex. Asks Diana Cazadora. Her last name is important because it literally meant hunter, which it had, right, its own humorous indication and representing an additional satiric strike. This had the immediate effect of ridiculing such straightforward and, for journalists, almost insulting association between women and the advice columns as well as women and the ambition to marry. Moreover, this parody allowed women journalists to mock the growing distinction between the feminine woman and the feminist, the former reputedly looking forward to marrying and the latter asking for unfit rights. In her mocking response to Cazadora, the hunter of men, right? Yeah? Cucufata stated that women should increase femininity in these times when so many out-of-line women are talking about female rights, while she explained how Cazadora could implement the best strategies to find a good man for herself or fail in such a quest. In Cucufata's pieces, failure drew nearer when women read and studied, but it faded away as they reconsidered their actions. But it unavoidably did come along as women demanded rights and treasured their own independent thinking minds, turning themselves into, quote, spinsters feminists. Quote, I'd also like to tell you that to reach every woman's goal, which is marriage, there are 3 paths, Cucufata claimed. The first is a straight line that leads directly to it. Good. The second is a sinuous line that after many laps finally reaches the long-awaited goal. The third is a spiral that gets lost without ever reaching the ideal oasis. She continued. The first way belongs to the very feminine girls who walk the lanes of simplicity. The second, to the readers who venture into the fields of knowledge. And the third, to the feminists who ask for rights, reason, and express their opinion. These will be spinsters by birth because they will never be able to reach the paradise of a home. Cucufata explained to Cazadora. Her scathing letter to Cazadora had the power to reveal the pejorative meaning of the word feminist, embedded in the existing and prevalent discourses about womanhood. It also exposed the absurdity of drawing a radical line between those women who aspire to be outspoken and those who wish to have a family of their own. It denounced the risk of such a divide, for it led to the conclusion that women's wishes for participatory action depended on whether they wanted to marry, and that if marriage were to be their choice, these women had to be acting upon their dull feminine nature. Also, in this rhetoric, women who would fight for their rights were giving up marriage and family. Drawing on Harry Jenkins' assertions about the politics of comedy in her analysis of the comic Marshall, historian Eric underlines that humorous sketches emerge in public forums like the media when established arrangements are finding ways in which they can be changed. In short, they appear when discourses are met with emerging counter-discourses that begin to problematize hegemonic assumptions and practices ruling societal models. Cucufata's satire complied with this. Her mockery of a rigid gender order in which women's only wish was thought to be being beautiful and to marry was possible because it coincided with the rise of women's own battles for inclusion in public life, as well as their battles for recognition as intellectually capable actors equal to men. In other words, because new ways to understand women's agency came into sight, in and by the creation of journalist narratives, the joke about the docile housewife, as required by patriarchy, became part of Agitación Femenina's writing repertoire. The counter-discourse of active public women began to compete with the dominant discourse of passive domestic women, thus making room for deriding hegemonic paradigms. But just as jokes demonstrate that existing rules are in the process of changing as new patterns arise, so too, as argued by Stephen Smith, do they rely on prejudice to function. Not only does humor work by depicting such prejudices when it is intended to enforce dominant views, but it also works when it is intended to condemn established norms. Without engagement with such prejudices, there are simply no jokes. Repeatedly enacting and staging prejudices, satire recreates its own ambiguous quality, one that holds its power to contestation, but also its risk to retell stories of power. Cucufata's satire was no different. While challenging backward notions of womanhood, her storytelling still drew its comic taste from women's portrayals that, at least on the surface, outcasted them. In Cucufata's columns, there was a beautiful, silly, and naive woman whose only wish was to marry. By her side, there was the ugly, old, well-read, and smart woman who became, quote, a spinster, in her own words. Every educated girl is ugly and old because study kills all feminine graces and makes them old, Cucufata reminded her readers. Both portrayals deprecated women in one way or another while attempting to filter her critique through the satire. And yet, things did not simply stay the same. Cucufata did advance a bitter attack on gender, something particularly successful because of her readership. It was intelligent readers of the periodical who, in dialogue with the text and editorial stand of the publication, were able to go beyond the surface and get the political meaning underneath such portrayals of subordinate women. As Benjamin Smith asserts in his study of political humor in Mexico in the 1940s, readers activated the intimate and dynamic relationship between the creators of humor and its audiences. These readers materialized and enhanced Cucufata's contentious tone and political goal. As a disruptive but still complicated, sometimes contradictory tool, Cucufata's satire storytelling preceded other women's journalist strategies that they later forged ahead to continue destabilizing existing exclusionary norms in the following decades, as they responded to changes in the political climate and while also responded to novel demands by women in the following decades. One such subsequent strategy would be Maria Aurora Escobar's in the 1950s and Flor Romero's in the 1960s. Thank you. Hola, okay, bien. So I'm happy to take any questions about what I just read and shared with you, but I'm also happy to, if you're curious to know something about the 1950s and 1960s, I'm also happy to take questions about that. Or if there are no questions, I'd be sad, but it's okay. You're not here to make me happy. Yes. Well, actually, I didn't know that cucufata was used in that way, the way that I described. But talking to a friend, you know, who happens to be the granddaughter of a very prominent woman in the 30s and 40s in Colombia, because she was the first graduate from social work in Colombia. So she's the first social worker, like professional social worker in Colombia. She told me about this, so I was able to dig in, you know, to delve into it and make more like research about it. So this is in everyday life, you know, among women. Women were calling themselves cucufata. So whenever they were just apparently doing something crazy, you know. So if I begin running here, which is, this is a professional setting, right? I should behave properly, right? If I do like unexpected, right, things, I'd be like not properly behaving, right? So they were saying, okay, Sandra, that's enough. You are looking like a cucufata, right? So what I really don't know is whether Uribe took that from, you know, her own social environment, or whether there was like a reciprocal, you know, engagement. I don't know if the readers were like reading Cucufata and my friend's grandmother, you know, was actually, they should be part of that social circle, you know. Uribe, she presented herself as a middle-class woman, but actually, you know, she was kind of, her origins were middle class, but of course she ended up, you know, being part of the elite. So I'm guessing that they might have shared some space, you know, some social space. So that's, I don't really know, and I don't have a way to know it, you know. So for the moment, you know, and for the book, and I'm just going for, you know, with the first portion of that. I know that it was used among social sectors, you know, educated social sectors, just to, okay, enough, that's enough, you're the cucufata. So it was something they used to stop people, but also to tease women, you know. So what I argue is that because it is cucufata is the name, right? It is not, she's a pro-establishment woman, right? She could be like, if you are making a satire out of that, right? You could say Mrs. Proper, Mrs. Tradition, right? And you still laugh, right? It's like, she's funny, come on, like you saw the quotes, right? But the fact that it is the signature, and the name is Cucufata, it adds something, right? Because everything she says is like, you're just being crazy. But no, you are being crazy because you are, not only because you're telling, you are giving this advice, but also because by giving this advice, we know that what you're doing is to celebrate women's rights, and that, even at a social setting, with drinks and all, that's, they would say, okay, Cucufata, enough. You're just being crazy. Yeah? Does that, yeah? Okay. So that's the story behind my finding about Cucufata and how it was used in social, in some social sectors in Colombia. And I know for sure this is coming from the middle of the country, because like in this country, right, which is pretty large country, this is a big country, you have differences between regions, right? So Californians are considered to be something different from the Northeast people, right? So same thing happens in Colombia. So we have like what we call people from the interior and people, and the lowlands, or especially the Caribbean, the coast. And that's like really different for us, like if you are in the highlands, right, you are like costeños are other kind of things, right? So for sure, I know this is something common, and the usage from the center of the country, the highlands, so where Agitación Femenina was born, and it was actually part of that circle. Yes, it is urban. And of course, although Agitación Femenina circulated in many cities and towns, around Colombia, it was stronger, and its readership was stronger in the middle of the country, meaning in the highlands, not in the coast, not in Caribbean Colombia. So that also, I know that. Yeah, thank you. No, thank you. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that question. Well, it's surprising. You would say that the readers were only, right, middle class and elite women, but no. I mean, this was very interesting about Agitación Femenina, but also about the time, it was, as I tried to convey, it was an intense, period, it was a hardcore decade. Then we got what we call la violencia, like the violence period. Can you imagine how violent it was that we call it the violence? I mean, it's like, I'm ashamed. But anyway, so this was, it was fervent, it was dynamic, it was chaos, which is always interesting, come on. So I'm just saying this because to actually to answer your question, right? And it is women, not only middle class and elite women read this, but also working class women. And we know that because there was, correspondence between these readers and the periodical. And how was the reception among middle class and elite women? They were very happy to have Agitación Femenina, so they were pleased with it. But amongst working class women, not so much. They didn't feel represented by the periodical and by, these crusades. They were like, okay, yes, but we have class issues, and those class issues come first to us. Because if we don't change the way, the economy is organized, I don't care if I can vote, I don't care if we have rights for our property, because we don't have any property. So what are you talking about? Like, yes, it sounds good. It sounds like it is something interesting, to look forward into the future, but not sure if that's what we need now. So it was controversial, but I, different from other periodicals, Agitación Femenina and its own founder and director editor, Ofelia Uribe, she was very brave because she usually circulated these confrontational, difficult letters within Agitación Femenina. And she really wanted to engage in a debate about it. And she didn't just publish this, as other women, like, okay, I want to, my print project, yes, okay, no, now I have to do something else. It didn't work, no. Ofelia Uribe was always contesting this until the end of her days. And she kept on going. This was her first project. Then she had Verdad, but then she continued, working in politics, activism. She wrote a book that is called Una voz insurgente, like an insurgent, parenthesis, female voice. So she was very active. And I think I do, as a historian, I do appreciate that, that she was actually including those different voices and that she wasn't afraid of confrontation. She cared. And I do say that I appreciate this as a historian because it is not easy to find that kind of thing in other newspaper sources. And you always see how, they were fighting for some women. They thought they were fighting for all of them, right? And still editorially, they were like hiding, the problematic things. I mean, we all do, right? I'm not blaming them. I'm just describing their behavior, right? Whereas with Ofelia Uribe, you find something, I don't know, exquisite in that sense, like she was like fully embodying the promise of women's rights. So does that answer? Yeah? So to make it short, the periodical was read by working class, middle class, and elite women. How was the reception? It depended on your privilege, right? So not much more different than it is nowadays, which this is why I love history. No, it's like, but it's a bit repetitive. Yeah, it is repetitive and we still do it. So like, let's wake up together. Okay, so what else? Who else? Thank you. Yeah. Well, I teach a class that is called Communication and Resistance or something like that, and it is all like based on history. Like, I'm a historian, so I always go back to the past. My students, well, I teach in a program that is called Digital Narrative. So it is like flexible and new kind of like the new age of journalism and communication. So for them, actually, the class that I teach is tough because they rather be editing a video or editing a podcast. And I'm like, but you have to have a content for that. So I took a time to complain, I'm sorry. Yes. Anyway, so, well, but they are not so much, no, they are not familiar with this kind of sources. Like I said, my students, in the program that I teach, they are used to other kind of, materials, but they are actually interested in gender and especially, like they are committed to rights. And you know that in Latin America, from Argentina to Mexico, we are very like engaged in that. Like we have inclusive languages like a must, especially if you're in Chile and Argentina. In Colombia, that's the case, and Mexico a bit less, but still. So it is because we are, and nowadays it is so important and it is so ingrained and so embedded. It is, everyday life is part of everyday life. So as soon as they see this kind of materials, they're like, okay, yeah, they are interested. But no, they are not so familiar, and I have never come across with a student that tell me, oh no, my grandmother. But I have to say that maybe 4 to 5 years ago, I was teaching another class, Media and Power, it was called. And I saw, the list of students. And I saw the name of, I don't remember her first name, I'm going to say Carolina Nora. And I was like, Carolina Nora, wait, she must be related to Flor Romero, the woman that I was talking about from the 1960s, because she was Flor Romero de Nora. I don't know if you know that we keep our last name when we marry. So Sanchez López is not my husband's last name, right? Sanchez is my father's last name. López is my mother's last name. And I keep both because I want to honor my mother, right? She gave birth to me, so I don't want to get rid of it. So Sanchez López. But before, right, still we didn't, in Latin America, we didn't remove our maiden last name, but we kept our own. But we described how now, after marriage, we belonged to someone else. So my mother would be Gloria López de Sanchez, right? Like of or belonging to Sanchez, which is, my father. So all this long story, but I'll get there, promise. I promise. So my father, Carolina Nora, right? Flor Romero was Carolina Nora, and Flor Romero was Flor Romero de Nora. And I was like, no, because Romero, of course, how many Romeros, how many Sanchez, López, González, that's plenty of us, right, in Latin America. But Nora is not so common. It's an odd, it's a rare, it's a, last name. And I approached her, like, hello, how are you? Are you related to Flor Romero? And she goes like, she's my grandmother. And I was like, oh, this is so exciting, how wonderful. No, I admire her. And yes, so she was not only acquainted with the, she didn't have an aunt. She was the, Flor Romero's granddaughter. Although I was very enthusiastic about it, and she was like, oh, how boring. And yes, but now we have Romero's personal archive, which is huge. It is housed at my university. So we are like working on cataloging and working with all of that. So I'm so happy to say that my insistence with these kind of things, it's working. So we have that. So I don't know. So yeah, I didn't answer your question, but I told an interesting story. So that's good, I guess. I don't know if I may take another question. I don't know the time. What time is it? Okay, good. Yes. It varies. For example, with Agitación Femenina, I know for sure that there were some fundraising with different women's organizations that were also, these organizations were working for women's rights, and they funded Agitación Femenina, but also advertisement was important for them. Mireya, which is a different periodical, and it is contemporary with Agitación Femenina, so from the 1940s. I know for sure it was not most, but like important money came from advertisement. And I know this not only because of the magazine, right? You can find a lot of pages with advertisement, but also because I know with an interview with the daughter of, the founder, that there were two founders of Mid-Age. One of them was in charge of like what we call marketing or whatever thing today. I don't know the word in English. So, so she was not like writing, the other one was the editor, the content wise, and this was knocking on doors. Hello, I'm this, my name is blah, blah, blah. So we need money from you guys, so please advertise in my, on my magazine. But of course, this also happened because they had some privileges. It is not that I'm Sandra Saēnchez, I love to print this and I love to, I have these ideas about women's rights. So it is, again, I'm Sandra Saēnchez de Cortizos, right? So my cousin who knows your aunt, who knows your blah. So that's why you can invest in my periodical. So actually these women were working hard to print their projects. It is not that when you have privilege, you don't have to work. I don't want to convey that, I don't want to convey that, I repeat. When you have privilege, you also have to work, But you do have some leverage that puts you, right, in a good position to do many things you wouldn't do otherwise. So they have a network, solid network, and they also had personal, well, not theirs, but their husband's support. And that means financial support. So, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, James.